Wow, you all stayed. When I was 12 years old, I prayed for rhythm. I know that sounds funny, but it's true. It's a very true story. I grew up going to a host of churches when I was a kid. The music was very different at every church. In the mornings, I went to a Baptist church, and the music you clap like this. And in the afternoons, I went to an African Methodist Episcopal church with my godfather. And you learned about African history, and you learned about the history and roots of black religiosity, et cetera, et cetera. And you kind of didn't really clap, you kind of swayed because you sang hymns. And then in the evenings, I went to Church of God in Christ, also known as Pentecostal Church or Holiness Church, which had a full-on band. So there was bass, there was drums, there was the organ, and the organ was like, dun, 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 dun. And the clapping was totally different. So in the mornings, we clap like this. And in the afternoon, I could not catch a beat in the evening. In the evening, I could not catch it. For whatever reason, no matter what, no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get the beat, which was a real challenge for like a little girl growing up in a black neighborhood, in a black community whose mother was just like, and you know, the stereotype that every black person has rhythm, but you know. Not everyone does, but, and so I prayed, and so imagine this 12-year-old in the pews just like praying and like clapping, full on concert happening around her, and there I was like, trying my best, praying, being persistent. And then one day it happened. I got it. It was as if God had poured an entire bucket of anointed rhythm all over me. I got it, and I went from in the morning doing this to in the evening going like this. And everyone would be dancing, and I would be dancing with them. And so it was amazing, this moment in time where I actually prayed for rhythm, and I got it. And then I felt complete. I tell you this story for a very specific reason, not to just take you through my childhood or anything like that and my interest in rhythm. But I tell you because in my work, I see this all the time. There's always one little kid in a room that is praying that no one sees them doing something that they wish they knew how to do. There's always at least one person in the room with extreme focus, tenacity. They actually are alert, and they're slightly on edge a little bit because they're worried about the fact that they may not be able to get it, whatever their it is. They're terrified. They're terrified of a host of things. They're terrified that they're going to get something wrong, that someone's not going to understand that they're trying. They're trying. And there's always the musician, the scholar, the artist, my colleagues, me, that is worried that the next body of work is just not going to cut it. They're worried all the time, and that was me. This common theme ran through my life, through my entire life. For most of it, let's say. It's not lack of confidence I'm talking about at all. It's not even like the fear of success or the fear of failure. It's the lesser known fear that most people don't talk about. It's the fear of being found out. It was early in my career when I found out about this thing. I was introduced to this concept. I took a 360 review as a part of a leadership institute focused on building the next generation of strategic thinkers in the arts. I was chosen. Has anyone taken one of these 360 reviews? I mean, it's painful. So you send out these surveys to all these people that report to you, or you report to them, or they have some random opinion about you or whatever. So you send them out and they fill them out, and they're all anonymous. Then you also fill it out yourself as the subject. The program I was in actually assigned a psychologist and a marketing exec to unpack the data with us. I was like, great. So I'm in my 20s and I'm unpacking the data. And the results of my test indicated with no uncertainty that I had the fear of being found out. So when I got this news, I almost like argued with the psychologist. I was like, you must be tripping. Seriously? I'm anxious from time to time, but I'm not hiding. I'm not lying. Are you calling me a liar? Are you saying that I'm even slightly dishonest? Like, that was offensive to me. I'm upfront. It's the thing that gets me in trouble. It's the thing that people love, mostly in trouble. So I placed a very high value on my work ethic around being transparent. But when I finally did sit down and think about the results, I did realize that much of my life had been shaped by fear. That some of my actions, my behaviors, my perceptions were really kind of connected to this idea. I just didn't call it that. Now, what I'm talking about is something different than faking it till you make it. I'm also not talking about code switching, where you speak the language of the people you're talking to. You're talking home this way, you go here, you say blah, blah, blah to your girlfriends, then you go into your office and you're like, and blah, blah, blah. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm also not talking about people that are really frauds. I'm not talking about that. So let's just be clear. I'm talking about things that are not strategies. I call those things I just mentioned strategies. We all use them. Every great professional uses faking it till you make it sometimes, right? You use those things. But what I'm talking about is the fear of being found out. It's when you work really hard. You actually know what you're doing. You know how to do it. You've done everything you can. And despite your hard work, despite your knowing exactly what you're doing, you still feel like someone's going to jump from behind that metaphorical door and say, aha, I got you. You think that someone's going to show up at your gala, let's just say if I ever got invited to the Met Gala, that someone's going to show up and tap me on the shoulder and say, oh my God, you stole someone else's invitation. That someone is going to, if I boil it down, call you a fake, a fraud. I was running this idea by one of my friends who happens to be a psychologist. And she said, oh my goodness, San, you have to talk about that. And I said, I gotta go to work tomorrow, are you kidding? And then other people told me they wanted to talk about it. I learned that this fear of being found out is actually a thing. It's called the impostor syndrome. I didn't get the memo. I wish someone had told me a long time ago. It actually started, there was this study done in the 70s. From what I understand, it's not a clinical disorder. It's kind of like a phenomenon. Apparently, 1 in 5 people have it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So it's interesting. And it turns out people like Justice Sonia Sotomayor has it. She's actually said she has it, that she's affiliated with it. There's people like Sheryl Sandberg, great business leader. Even Albert Einstein said that he might have suffered from it towards the end of his life. It's amazing. In fact, the other thing that I think is so interesting about this is that it's apparently reserved for high-achieving people. Another thing, I'm like, can I get the memo? Really? So 70% of that 1 in 5, 70% of them are considered gifted. So what lies behind this malady is the anxiety that one's work just isn't good enough. That you actually have the inability to do good work. No matter how hard you try, you just will never get it. So to mitigate that, I set on the path of getting it right. I spent my entire life doing this, dotting my I's, crossing my T's, doing it again, doing it again. So my senior year of college, just to give you another example, I changed my major from biology, senior year, to art history. And they say art and science don't it? Yeah. So I changed my major, and I did that because I just felt called to this work for a host of reasons, totally different talk. I have very little experience in this, in art history, and I just knew it was right for me. So I actually got this gig curating exhibitions at the University Gallery. And I started curating exhibitions. I had no idea what I was doing. I would study and I would talk to people and I would go and measure the space. I would talk to people, I would talk to artists, I would go to do studio visits, then I'd go and I'd like measure the space again. And then I'd talk to someone and then I'd measure the space again. And I was exhausted. All of this anxiety overwhelmed me. Being in college, I had a true commitment to not doing drugs, and I also didn't have a lot of money. And so I leaned on something that was accessible to me, and my escape was TV. I know none of you watch television, but I watch TV. So I watched television, and so one night I stopped everything. I put down the books. I didn't call anybody. I didn't interview anyone. I didn't go measure the space. I didn't do anything. I turned on the TV, and to my surprise, there it was, a Soul Train marathon. I was binge watching before the phrase ever was invented. People were dancing all over the place. Their afros, their jeans were like tight at the waist, flowing at the bottom. It was amazing. The style, the glamour, the way they moved their bodies, everyone just was free. It was incredible. So on the main stage, it was reserved for like major acts. And then there was like the Soul Train line. And there I was in the middle of my apartment doing my own one-woman Soul Train line. I was all over the place. And then there was the show's host, Don Cornelius. He appeared at the end of every show. And he would say his famous mantra, "I wish you peace, love, and soul," with his hand in the air. And it was amazing. I just became consumed by it. Watching Soul Train allowed me to escape for just a second and be visually consumed by a creative explosion of style, swagger, and confidence. I was watching the manifestation of freedom on TV. Wow. So as a result, I made an exhibition that was at once personal, responsive to the interest of others, but also full of just a little swagger and just a little confidence. The fear and anxiety I felt during that time is the same fear and anxiety I see on the faces of friends, colleagues, students, parents. The uncertainty that not knowing, not being sure of how you're doing and what you're doing is going to be enough. I'm not certain if the development of my fear of being found out was informed by the fact that I was born into a family of little resources, or if it's a symptom of choosing to work in an industry filled with luxury goods and extreme wealth. I might have been resource poor, but I'd like to think I was intellectually rich. I mean, listen, I studied Marxist theory here in this very building in the curatorial studies program of the Whitney. I know how to talk about art. I know how to get people to fall in love with going to museums when they think they didn't even like them. I'm good at that. But there was a time when I would not have felt comfortable standing here, not on this stage in front of you, but standing in a museum holding a position. I wouldn't have felt comfortable in the very space where I work. So when I walk up those grand stairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, my 12-year-old self is kind of impressed. You know? She's not impressed because I have this amazing job as chairman of education. That's not what impresses her. She's impressed because, honestly, like so many people visiting museums and other types of cultural institutions, I once felt completely and utterly out of place, and now I don't. My discomfort wasn't about the museum itself. It was about my own personal history juxtaposed against the concept of a museum. It was about how I felt. So when I talk about my 12-year-old self being proud, It's about realizing what I should have known a long time ago. That my discomfort is actually what makes me incredibly comfortable. And more importantly, I belong wherever I want to be. So over time, what I've come to realize is that many people have at the very least a little piece of themselves that have shared the same fear that I've carried around with me in secret for a very long time. I suppose if I'm looking at this critically, I can look at the fear of being found out in a number of ways. It was a motivator. It motivated a 12-year-old girl to persist and get rhythm. It motivated a fragmented college student to look for motivation and inspiration in the least likely of places. And it motivated a little girl from the Bay Area, San Francisco, to find tenacity to succeed on her own terms. It taught me that imagination is actually not something that kind of happens to you. It's actually a skill that you have to cultivate, and it's a tool. The musician Questlove once said that Don Cornelius from Soul Train was his first hero, that he brilliantly tricked us into loving ourselves. I completely agree. Watching Soul Train wasn't about sitting on a couch and taking a break. I thought that's what it was then. It was about using my imagination to envision another version of myself, seeing outside of myself, like actually looking into the distance and seeing what I could possibly do and doing it myself. At some point in many of our lives, we've walked around nervous about whether or not our arrival at a particular place was because of pure luck or chance, that we had nothing to do with it, that it just happened. Somehow, someone was generous enough or kind enough to overlook what we thought were our insecurities, inappropriateness, or our own whatevers, and they graciously allowed us to sit at their table. This perceived gift of accommodation often makes people perform a facsimile of who they really are, when all they have to do is be themselves, their authentic selves. I no longer have the fear of being found out. I have nothing to hide. This is me. It's always been me. Persistent, committed, hardworking. I'm built that way. I was trained that way. For those of you who have felt this fear of being found out, I say three things. One, you are not alone. You are actually a part of a tribe of people that are in the constant pursuit of greatness. You're driven. Two, growth and change creates anxiety, so use it. Because you struggled with this, you're actually incredibly sensitive and pretty empathetic. And three, relax. Because the real you, independent of pretense, is the freest, most efficient person you can be. It is the most effective way of living. All that other stuff just simply distracts from who you are and your greatness. There are times when I think this whole thing is a farce, completely void of any merit at all. The only reason I even acknowledge this thing, this fear of being found out, the impostor syndrome, is because at one time it took up so much space in between my head and my heart. And that's the space that should be reserved for natural exploration, not doubt. The truth of the matter is that even without rhythm, my 12-year-old self would have been just fine. Thank you.